A new trade deal with the European Union is the most comprehensive Kenya has ever signed. And at 25 years long, it certainly has longevity too. But has Kenya put unity with its East African partners at risk and endangered regional stability? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Kenya's trade deal with the European Union is big news for the country. Its vegetables, fruits, tea and coffee will soon be sold tariff-free across Europe. But has Nairobi left its East African neighbours in the lurch as a result?
The European Union is Kenya's second biggest trading partner after China. Equally as important, it's the biggest exporter too. That's why the 25-year economic partnership agreement has been hailed by Prime Minister William Ruto as a remarkable partnership. It was reportedly one of the fastest deals the EU has ever signed.
On behalf of the European Union, it's my great honour to be here for what is a truly historic occasion. The conclusions of the negotiations of Economic Partnership Agreement marks a new and exciting departure in our relations.
The agreement will grant Kenyan products immediate, duty-free, quota-free entry into the EU from the day it comes into effect. And in recognition of our varied stage of progress along the development journey, products from the EU will progressively receive duty reductions over a period of 25 years.
But there are rumours that Kenya's neighbours are not overly impressed. Previous talks had centred on a deal involving all the countries of the East African Community, a small regional bloc made up of 6 nations. But the agreement the EAC brokered in 2016 never got going because the other nations refused to sign, and so Kenya has now signed up on its own. So why did Nairobi risk alienating local partners?
Joining me today to discuss this, we have Fergus Kell, who's a researcher at the Africa Programme at Chatham House, specialising in East Africa. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, we have Edgar Odari, who's Executive Director at Eco News Africa, and Ali Khan Sachu, who's Chief Executive Officer of Rich Management and a geopolitical and geoeconomics commentator. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me. Ali Khan, I'm going to start with you if I can. This deal done by Kenya with the European Union, when Kenya is a member of the East African community, surely that's going to annoy the other members of the East African community because they'll feel, well, hang on, we're in a gang, we should have done this together.
I would have thought so, but I haven't heard a murmur out of any other country this time around. Last time, when this agreement was being promised, there was a tremendous pushback. But it's been total radio silence this time around, which caught me by surprise. So I am surprised by that. It seems everyone's bandwidth is being used with other things at the moment, and there hasn't been much of a pushback this time.
Why do you think that might be? Do you think it's that everybody is hopeful this deal's going to work and so they're sort of sitting there on the sidelines and waiting it out? Or do you think they're hoping for crumbs from the deal to fall through to them? There are a lot of different ways they could be taking this.
So I think the Europeans are hoping that this template can be parlayed into an EAC-wide agreement. Kenya, I think, are probably thinking to themselves, you know, we can be the leader in this space. And I think the other East African countries are just standing on the sidelines and let's see how you get on. And if you get on well, we'll jump on. But if not, you know, we won't be within the context of that agreement, is the way it looks to me.
Fergus, is that how you see this?
I think it's important to reflect on the build-up to this deal and the fact that back in 2021 at the Summit of Heads of State of EAC countries, there was an agreement on a principle of so-called variable geometry, which suggested that countries such as Kenya could pursue a separate deal themselves away from the other countries in the EAC. There is some debate emerging over whether that principle is applicable in this sense, because generally it's been used in internal matters within the EAC rather than external partnerships. But certainly I think Kenya will be counting on that principle from the Heads of State Summit, which was agreed on during their tenure as chair.
Edgar, you're actually in Nairobi, so I've got to ask, what's the feeling like on the ground there, and what's your personal feeling about this? Should Kenya have gone it alone on this front?
No, it shouldn't. Actually, I tend to agree with the gentleman from Chatham House that, you know, there was an agreement done in 2021, a decision by the East African Heads of State Summit that allowed Kenya to implement the EPA on a variable geometry basis. However, I think there's been a misinterpretation by the Kenyan government in the sense that they have opened up a new front of negotiations to be part of the agreement, when the mandate they were given was to implement the existing agreement as negotiated. So by opening up a new front of negotiations in this regard, they have basically thrown out the provisions of the EAC law, East Africa Community law, that relates to notification of other partners if you're getting into a new kind of agreement.
So what's happened with, say, Tanzania or with Ethiopia? How have they reacted to the fact that the Kenyans have gone out and done this deal?
Well, the sense I'm getting from at least the Tanzanian political circles is that countries are not, various segments within the country are not happy with the fact that Kenya has negotiated a new addition to the agreement, as it were, because the mandate that was given was that of implementing the agreement as was negotiated by the time it was being given, Kenya was given the mandate to implement the agreement. But there's a feeling that Kenya has gone ahead and negotiated a new chapter on trade and sustainable development, which is problematic to the region because it gives new legal obligations to the agreement.
Ali Khan, so could this create potentially disunity? Obviously, the whole idea of having an East African community is to create greater stability throughout the region. Does this put that in jeopardy, or is that overblown?
I think obviously it does, because Kenya sort of run ahead of its other partners, so it does create that potential. I think the driving force behind this agreement is as follows. I think it was the desire by the Europeans to find a geo-economic, geopolitical partner on the African continent in an environment where you had South Africa, you know, sort of going very pro-Russia in this Ukraine situation, and we had a relatively friendless environment for the Europeans. So I think that drove it. Kenya's strong partner. Kenya's leaning in back to its old partners in the West, has huge debts to pay back to China. It's using money that's coming in from the West, the IMF, the World Bank, to pay those loans back. So it's a partnership that suits Kenya and its European partners right now. OK,
so I'm going to ask you now, very clear what Kenya would be getting out of this deal, because it's trade tariff-free access into, or duty-free access into the European Union. What's Europe getting out of it? Is it having a friend in Africa and it doesn't have many?
That's absolutely the point. I think that's what it feels. That's what the ambassadors in Nairobi are telling me. They feel that Kenya is very supportive of the European G7 US agenda, and they welcome that. And I think you see that translating in immediate disbursements from the IMF and the World Bank in support of Kenya. And I think that's clearly what's going on here. Bear in mind, what Kenya has achieved was already in place from 2014. Kenya has had tariff-free access to the European markets, albeit not codified in any agreement, but essentially they've had that. And I think for the Europeans, there is an opportunity here to use Kenya as a potential platform for industrialization, supporting the development of the Kenyan economy, because the Europeans are very concerned about the number of Africans popping over the Mediterranean, and at some point they're going to have to develop Africa to keep these immigrants in the continent.
Fergus, so I've got to put it to you then. Are you in agreement with that? What do you see the European Union getting out of this? It's fairly clear what Kenya gets out of it, apart from a row with its neighbours.
I think the EU will also take a longer-term view of this deal. I think initially we have a plan for tariffs on the Kenyan side to be phased out over a period of 25 years. But also, I think, as Ali Khan was saying in his opening remarks, the EU is intending for other EAC members to join this deal. And in fact, if you look at the terms of the deal itself, it very rarely refers to Kenya itself, but rather to EAC partner states. It's effectively a copy and paste of the 2016 deal, which Kenya signed up to as part of the EAC, but the other members did not sign up to. And with the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, now joining the EAC, I think the EU sees an opportunity as well to bring one state on board with the expectation that others will follow down the line.
OK, so now I've got a slightly different question, which is, why didn't anyone else sign up for the deal?
I think there's a few reasons, but probably the largest one is a concern over a flood of imports coming into African markets from the EU.
This is mostly farming produce, isn't it? Things like milk.
Dumping. And I think that's what the real scare is about. I'd agree with what, you know.
Yeah, there's a concern around dumping. I think certainly in Kenya specifically, there's been issues that we've seen in recent months. Protests have emerged over Chinese products that have arrived in Kenya and are being sold at extremely low prices and pushing Kenyan marketeers out of the market. So I think there's a concern there, and I think other countries in the region share those concerns. They're worried about their industrial trajectory.
Right, well, I've got, hold on there, because I've got a quote here from the European Union Commissioner for Trade. Here's what the EU Commissioner for Trade had to say.
This agreement contains strong ambitions on trade and sustainable development. Indeed, this is the most ambitious trade deal the EU has concluded with any African country when it comes to climate protection, labor rights, and gender equality. This will benefit both sides, our people, our environment, and our climate. And let's be clear, it will also benefit our economies.
Edgar, so first question I'm going to ask you on this is, do you think Kenya's getting a good deal out of this?
No, it's not. Actually, this deal basically does two things. It looks for new markets for European products, and is also meant to source raw materials from the East African community back to European industries to be able to use them for their own purposes. The reason I say this is because, you know, if you look at the market access provisions, Kenya is going to open up about 82.6% of its market. Yet, when it comes to, you know, it sounds like, you know, Kenya is receiving duty-free, quota-free market access to Europe. But in reality, there are a number of bottlenecks that come against that, including rules on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, rules on, safeguards that Europe is supposed to meet. And because of this, then, you have a market, but you're not able to access it. Technically, you have a market and you don't have it in the same breath.
Okay, yeah? let me put this slightly differently then, if I can. Is the problem here going to be that, yes, Kenya gets tariff-free access into the European Union, but it's exporting raw materials, and so there's not quite so much value added, and then Europe gets to export back finished products, and so it gets to take the profit?
Yes. So if you look at, in economics, as Ali will tell you, there's the question of who is taking the surplus value. We have traded between Europe and Kenya, yes, but it's Europe that's taking the bulk of the surplus value because we're only trading in raw materials, if you will, and we buy finished products from Europe. So the trade is imbalanced in favor of Europe.
Okay, Ali Khan, let me bring that across. Are you in agreement with all of that, or do you think Kenya's getting a good deal here?
Well, where I would take issue is, for example, I don't know what value addition you can do with flowers. Flowers, 70% of Kenya's flowers go into the European Union, so that's something that you can't necessarily value add. If you look at vegetables and fruit, these are big components of the total volume, which is 3.2 billion euros per year, both ways. However, what I do agree with is we've got to look at value addition. I think where there was some attempt to address that is in encouraging FDI, industrial development in Kenya, encouraging European companies maybe to come into Kenya and look at the industrial development side, and then use those industries to export into Europe. But I agree about friction. There's a lot of friction in terms of accessing European markets. They have conditions which most Kenyan companies might not be able to meet, except those who've targeted that economy for quite a while. So I agree, but also there are challenges in terms of the types of things we're sending.
Okay, we knock back into the friction argument here, though, with neighbours, because those are exactly the same kinds of things Ethiopia exports to the European Union as well, especially cut flowers. It's a big market for the Ethiopians, coffee also as well. So are we not getting into that same kind of area where there'll be a row, because now Kenya will be able to undercut one of its closest trading partners?
The advantage Ethiopia has is that technically on price it should be able to undercut Kenya. Just because of the nature of where it is. So I think, you are right, there will be friction between Ethiopia and Kenya in terms of accessing those markets. You're talking about coffee. Uganda is exporting a lot of coffee. into Europe, but encountering a tremendous amount of friction. So it's all dynamic. I can't give you an overall macro view on the whole thing, but I think I'm not as pessimistic as Edgar is. I think there is an opportunity to leverage this relationship. It's been there a long time. Of course, the Europeans have an interesting agenda which might not resonate as much in a developing country.
Well, there's loads to explore in that, but I do have to move on because we've got to talk about China. Both of you have brought up the C word already. Last time I was in Kenya was quite a while ago, but it was about 12 years ago. And at that stage, I went over to Nairobi University, and there was an entire department there that was being financed by the Chinese government, and they were teaching Kenyans how to speak Mandarin and Cantonese. This looks like the European Union is trying to catch up. Because the Chinese are already in there and they have a lot of investments in that region. Is that fair or is that not fair?
I think China is part of this story, and I think we have seen the EU attempting to compete with China, perhaps most prominently in its Global Gateway Initiative, which is seeking to rival the Belt and Road Initiative by China in terms of infrastructure investments and so on. But I think relating to trade specifically, I think the EU is aware that it has slightly more leverage than China in some respects. So China is Kenya's largest source of imports, whereas in terms of exports to China, it's very marginal for Kenya, whereas for the EU is the largest source of Kenyan exports. So it's a very important market there. And the EU wants to leverage that relationship. So I think as well, we shouldn't just focus exclusively on China here, because Kenya has already signed a deal with the UK that's more or less identical, bar some annexes.
Well, that's got to be the next question, is where's the UK in all of this? Because, of course, it's not part of the European Union anymore.
It's not part of the European Union, but actually the UK has already signed what is effectively the same deal in terms of the text, as I mentioned previously. And I think the UK has played a role in saying to the EU, well, we've signed this with Kenya, why don't you go ahead and do it as well? So that deal has been in place since 2020 between the UK and Kenya. This new EU deal essentially retains the same terms but adds some annexes on trade and development. So I think in that sense, we should understand that there are other competing interests here. The US as well, who Kenya is exploring a trade deal with as well. The United Arab Emirates as well. So I think there's a danger of focusing overly on the China relationship there.
Edgar, let me bring this across to you, because we've been hearing from both the other guests about the nature of the European Union trying to get a friend in the African continent. And of course, China's already there. So how do you see this sort of, this position of the European Union versus China in Kenya?
So the agreement with Kenya is strategic in the sense that Kenya is an important pivot point to the east. You know, when you get access to Kenya, you have access to the various markets on the East African coast. And because of that, the EU was looking at Kenya as a strategic partner to be able to engage on this front. However, you know, like the previous speaker said, you know, there are many deals that are coming in. The US is coming in with its deals. We have deals with the United Arab Emirates. And we still have challenges in terms of the kind of trade that we do with China. So strategically speaking, it is a win for the EU, because then it places Kenya on a pedestal to be able to provide a launch pad into the East African community and beyond.
Edgar, you seem very down on the EU side of this deal. So what would you have liked to have seen the Kenyan government do differently? I mean, would you rather they hadn't done a deal with the EU? Would you rather they'd included their neighbours? How would you have done it differently?
For me, the deal undermines regional integration. A deal they would have waited to have a deal that encompasses all the other East African community countries, so that, you know, you do that deal as a region. Because first of all, if you look at the way the East African community is structured, the deal should have been done with all the other countries, so that you have a maintenance of regional integration across the region, because that is supposed to build towards the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. But when you start segmenting and, you know, moving Kenya in one direction and the other East African countries are moving in a different direction, then you're undermining the very spirit of integration that has been there since the year 2000 from the East African community.
Ali Khan, what does this mean for everybody else? Do they now sign their own separate deals, or do they sort of badger Kenya? Do they use Kenya, if you like, as a battering ram? Because then they sort of export stuff across the border into Kenya, do another little bit of stitching, and then send it straight into the European Union.
That's an interesting thought. I think the most friction within the EAC community is across borders, actually, what we've discovered in terms of exports within the community has been quite tricky. But I think what the Europeans are relying on is Kenya being kind of a lodestar and everybody else folding into this agreement as it moves along. And essentially, I do think that's what's going to happen. I don't think, and I think that's why we haven't heard much noise coming out of the partner countries about this particular agreement. So overall, I see that happening. I think Kenya is unique in the sense that what's very interesting, you know, Fergus was mentioning the UAE, US, Europe. When you look at that constellation of powers, you understand what Kenya is doing, and Kenya is leaning away from China and leaning into this side, in part because of the financial balance sheet concerns, but also, and because of the support that's emanating from these countries. Just take President Ruto's visits. He's been to Germany about 3 times, France about twice. So you can just see what's going on in the Kenyan foreign policy, and I think this is an expression of that.
Fergus, I'm seeing a lot of nodding there, so I'm assuming you're in agreement with a lot of that. So let me ask you slightly differently. Where does Kenya take this from here if it's getting all of these different trade deals around the world? There were a lot of people very optimistic that the EAC was going to be some new European Union for Africa, that suddenly Africa's economy would take off, having lagged behind, say, Southeast Asia over much of the last 20 years. Can the East African community now meet that potential?
I think so. I mean, I think it's important to reflect on that this isn't anything new, disunity within the EAC. I think we've seen high-profile trade disputes, as Ali Khan was mentioning, at borders between Tanzania and Kenya, Kenya and Uganda. Many of the countries in the region have had disputes in the past. So I think what this is about is, in the longer term, a lot of these countries will be graduating into lower middle income status. And that's where we start to see the trading relationship with the EU starts to change. The access that they had previously under the everything but arms agreement changes, and so these countries will, Tanzania especially, which will become the biggest economy in the region predicted in the next 10 years, they will have to start changing their approach and looking to negotiate new deals because those previous terms will have expired. So I think those countries, they'll need to get in line behind Kenya at some stage.
Now, the deal also mentions climate protection rather a lot. That's not top of the agenda in a place like Kenya, where obviously lifting people out of poverty is. So what's in there with this?
Well, I would say Kenya has really sought to be a climate leader on the global stage. It's very much been on the agenda of the current administration. Kenya's a leader in terms of renewable energy in Africa, particularly geothermal energy. It will be hosting a major international summit in September with the African Union focused on climate issues in Africa. So I think it is really seen as an opportune moment to partner with Kenya around climate change issues.
Edgar, if I bring this across to you, when it comes to climate change, how much of an issue is that for voters in Kenya? Kenya is a democracy. The voters are going to be presented with the state of the economy, which, of course, the president is hoping is going to grow because of this deal. How do you think voters are going to feel about it?
Climate change, while I agree and recognize as an issue, it doesn't ring anywhere near the voters' list of priorities, because first of all, we need to grow industries, create jobs, and lift people out of poverty. So someone cannot be struggling with the next paycheck and you're telling them to address the issue of climate. And I don't say this because I do not recognize the importance that climate change presents in terms of challenges to the Kenyan economy. I say this because, knowing fully well that the Kenyan voters have more pressing needs, I don't think they will be hard-pressed to start addressing climate change issues. However, that said, I would like to point out that it's an important issue, just that the way it's been approached in the agreement is what I seem to have a challenge with, because the common but differentiated responsibilities principle has not been followed. We are basically just lumping up obligations of the Paris Climate Agreement without necessarily looking at the balance of obligations between the EU on the one hand and Kenya on the other hand.
For the European Union, usually when it does deals, there's some kind of stipulation in there, and there isn't in this case, about freeing up visa restrictions or allowing more access for work entry and visas and allowing people to move back and forth between the two blocks. There isn't in this case, and Kenya has a very large youth unemployment problem. Is it disappointing for you that there isn't more access for the people of Kenya to, say, working in the European Union?
Well, the deal doesn't open up. Trade in services is supposed to be opened up, I think, in the next chapter of negotiations. I think that's now Article 3 of the agreement. And when they open up, there's something called, free movement of people comes under, I think, the 4 modes of trading services. And one of them is Mode 4.
Edgar, Ali Khan, Fergus, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel and just go there and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.